camera. You'll have my camera and switch over to.
There you are.
Right. So good evening, everyone. Welcome to the community workshop on the housing element. This is part of the general plan update. I'm Zina Bradford, City Manager with the City of Solvang, and we have our team with Amintia Harnish, our consultants for the general plan update, here with us.
Zina?
Yes. I can hear somebody speaking. So we're going to go ahead and turn this over to our consultants, who will be walking through the. Yes, I can hear somebody speaking.
Zina appears to be talking and I can't hear her.
Okay, can you check?
I can hear her.
Everything's unmuted.
Mark, can you hear me?
Mark, I can hear her. Technical difficulties, I can understand.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, we'll continue to move forward and let our consultants introduce themselves. They will be presenting us with a presentation in the housing element, which will follow by Q&A session. Please go ahead, team.
Okay, thank you for that introduction. I'm just going to share my screen here. Okay, can you see my PowerPoint here?
Yep.
Yes.
All right, cool. So yeah, thank you for having us today for the first community workshop of the Housing Element Update.
There we are.
My name is Ryan Lester. I'm the project manager for the consultant team on the Housing Element Update. With us tonight, we also have Jim Harnish. He's the project director for the general plan update. And then Ryan Russell, who's an associate planner with Rincon Consultants, and he and his team are in charge of one aspect of the housing element called the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Analysis. So he'll be here in case there are any questions about that. So our agenda for tonight, there's a lot to talk about. I'll try not to move too quickly, but I'll try not to move too slowly either, because I want to definitely leave enough time to take your comments and questions. So we're going to start with some housing element basics. If you've been involved in the general plan or the housing element in the past, it may be a little repetitive to you, but we'll go through those for anyone who's new, so everyone's on the same page. We'll talk about the regional housing needs allocation, which is really the identified need that the housing element is responding to. We'll talk about meeting those housing needs. We'll talk about this new section, Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing, and then we'll have discussion and quickly talk about next steps in the project. So housing element basics. So what is a housing element? Housing element is an element of the city's general plan. It's actually required by state law to be updated in very specific 8-year cycles. We are currently preparing the 6th cycle housing element, which plans for the years 2022 to 2031. And the previous was the 5th cycle. So you may hear 5th cycle housing element versus 6th cycle. We're currently in the 6th cycle. So what does a housing element do? Well, a housing element provides an assessment of both current and future housing needs. It identifies opportunities and constraints. It establishes goals, policies, and programs to meet housing needs. And then finally, and importantly in this cycle, is it updates city practices and regulations to reflect new state laws. And we'll talk about those in a minute. So a little bit further, the housing element works to identify strategies and programs that focus on conserving and improving affordable housing, maximizing housing opportunities throughout the community, which is important, assisting in the provision of affordable housing, removing constraints, and then promoting fair and equal housing opportunities. So I mentioned new state laws. So in the 5th cycle planning period, the state passed a number of new laws that affect housing elements. And so this is the first slide. I actually have 2 slides here of laws. We're not going to go through each of these. I just want to show you that a big part of the update in the 6th cycle is responding to these new laws, saying whether or not the city complies, and if the city doesn't comply, adding a program to the housing element to ensure the city complies in the future. page 2 of these laws, you'll see accessory dwelling units. There are a number of laws passed, a number of bills passed regarding that, density bonus, and then things like emergency and transitional housing that need to be responded to as well, both in the housing element and in the zoning code. So our project, just a little bit about the schedule. Today we're at community workshop, and we're actually going to call this community workshop number 1 because we decided that even though we hadn't had one planned, we're going to hold a second community workshop to really get into the nitty-gritty on the site's inventory. So community workshop 1 today, community workshop 2 will be in 3 to 4 weeks. We're looking at preparing and releasing a public review draft this summer, which we'll take to Planning Commission and City Council study sessions. And then based on those, we'll make revisions and we will submit to HCD in the fall. Then HCD, by the way, is the Department of Housing and Community Development. It's a state department, and they are responsible for actually certifying the housing element. So they have 90 days to review our draft. They'll work with us on revisions. We'll go back and forth. They'll submit a letter, their comment letter. We will do any final responses to that and submit the final adopted housing element has to be submitted by February 15th, 2023, or within 120 days of that date. They give you a 120-day grace period. So the regional housing needs allocation, I mentioned this earlier. This is a big part of the housing element. This is the quantified housing need that the city needs, that all jurisdictions in California receive and need to respond to. So what is the RHNA? So the RHNA is the representation of future housing needs for all income levels in the city for the next 8 years. And it's the minimum number of housing units the city is required to plan for by providing adequate sites through zoning. The housing element does not, the city and the housing element do not produce housing, but the housing element plans for sites, appropriate sites for housing. So the RHNA is developed first, you can see our little graphic here. It's developed first regionally by the state. HCD makes a regional determination that is then handed down to regional councils of government, in this case, the Santa Barbara County Association of Governments, SBCAG. And the regional governments then create a methodology that splits up the units to the individual jurisdictions. Those are passed down to the individual jurisdictions who respond to them in the housing element, and then each year report on how many permits have been approved, and all that data goes back to the state for the next round, and they come up with a new regional allocation for the next cycle. So all the 6th cycle data will go into them, and they'll make a new regional determination for the 7th cycle. So again, the 6th cycle that we're planning for right now is February 2023 to February 2031. So the RHNA can be a little confusing because there's actually 2 processes going on. There's the process of the housing element planning land to accommodate the need, right? So HCD requires, the housing element requires land zone for each income category and programs to support development on those sites, right? And then once the housing element is adopted and certified, then each year the city reports the number of units permitted within each category. HCD reviews that progress and may require the city to adopt additional incentives to encourage housing if they're not hitting milestones and objectives. So the housing element really right now, we're really focused on planning land for housing, providing capacity for housing. So what does the RHNA look like? So for Solvang, looking at the RHNA, this top row here is the RHNA allocation for the city. So you can see it's in multiple income categories. So very low, 55 units, low, 39 units, moderate, 22 units, and above moderate, 75 units. So the city needs to plan for 191 units. Now, one of the new state laws that came into effect since the fifth cycle, is that all cities, all jurisdictions have to plan an extra 20%. They call this a buffer in the lower and moderate income categories. And that's just because cities and counties are planning for this land, but the reality of development doesn't always work out that way. Maybe a site gets developed it was planned for lower incomes and it gets developed at moderate incomes. The state doesn't want us to go negative and have they want us to have a buffer so that if one or two sites get developed in a different way than what we provided capacity for, that we still have enough land planned for lower and moderate income income categories. So lower income RHNA categories, and to plan for them, we can count a few things. So we can count residential sites that are zoned at a density that's above HCD's default density, which is 20 dwelling units an acre. So vacant residential sites in zones that allow 20 dwelling units an acre. And then other sites that count are affordable units with deed restrictions. So maybe development comes in and it's 8 units and one of them is deed restricted for very low and the other 7 are above moderate. That deed restricted unit would ensure that it would remain available to lower income households for whatever time period is established within that deed restriction. So a little technical, but those are the two main ways to provide for those income categories. So meeting housing needs, how do we go about, okay, we know what the RHNA is, we know there's a buffer, how do we plan, how do we go about actually planning for this housing? So there's kind of a 3-step approach. This is a little simplified, but it definitely gets the point across. And I want you to understand the process that we're going through. We are, as I said, we are going to have a separate workshop on actual sites. So I'm really trying to explain the process that we go through so you understand what the housing element is doing, rather than commenting on individual sites at this time. So our approach to meeting the RHNA, so we can count credits, so we can count current projects and a projected number of ADUs based on trends in the city. And then we look to identify sites. So we look for vacant parcels in residential zones. And if there aren't enough to provide for the RHNA, then we can look to find additional solutions. So perhaps rezoning vacant non-residential sites to allow residential uses, or perhaps rezoning underutilized commercial parcels to allow for high-density multifamily residential or mixed use. So counting credits, again, like I said, housing projects under review or approved through planning and expected to be built during the planning period are counted. And then ADU trends, so we just make a little calculation based on the last 3 years, average it out, and then multiply it times 8. So what does that look like? We have our RHNA with a buffer, which is a total of 215 units that we're shooting for. And we can add up our pending projects and our ADU trends. So pending projects, we have coming in about 45 very low income units, 10 moderate income units, and 30 above moderate income units. And if you're interested, those are listed here, the projects we're counting. And then ADU trends, again, 64 units, and we're counting those half towards moderate income units and half towards above moderate income units. And then, so we total those, and then we look at what's the remaining need. So remaining, a total of 66 units are needed, which looks to be about just under 70 in the lower income categories, with a slight surplus in moderate and about equivalent remaining need in above moderate. So really what we need to try to plan for are these units here, these about 70 units for these lower income categories. So sites identified for those categories, they have to meet specific requirements. So they have to have appropriate density. So they have to, 20 dwelling units per acre has to be allowed. And then they have to be an appropriate parcel size. So they need to be between half an acre and 10 acres. And that's just a HCD's requirement based on what they feel is feasible. And so the steps we take, first, it's pretty easy. We find vacant sites, and then we highlight those between half an acre and 10 acres. I'll show you what that looks like. This is just an example. Again, we'll get into this in workshop 2. But so we've got a map here. I pull up vacant sites, and then I highlight the ones with this blue line that are over half an acre. We've zoomed in on this little area here, and you can just see this is the process we go through. Looking for vacant sites, looking for the ones that are half an acre. And then the next thing we do is, okay, what's the zoning on these? Do any of these currently allow 20 dwelling units an acre? What we can see just by looking at that is that none of the current vacant sites meet HCD's density requirements for lower income housing. So the next step we'll have to take is, the next step we'll be asking is, are there any that are appropriate to upzone to allow 20 dwelling units an acre? I've given an example here just of the calculation we have to do. So if these two parcels were to be upzoned to allow greater density, we do a little calculation. This is just an example, if the density were to be 20 to 24, say, because 20 is the minimum, we can just multiply it by the acreage, and we get a unit count. So what we're looking to do is find parcels that we can, that are appropriate for 20 dwelling units an acre. We run a little calculation, we get 110 units. And if you remember, we were talking about we need to plan for about 70 lower income units. So just based on looking at this, we can see that we're gonna need to find like 5 to 6 acres minimum to accommodate the remaining lower income RENA. We'll have to look at all those sites. We have to consider constraints on each one. We have to consider fair housing in the sites that we choose. The sites can't be, a city can't, for instance, put all the high density sites in an area with high segregation and poverty, for instance. So we have to consider fair housing where we choose these sites. And so it's an exercise in
Ryan,
yes.
I've got a question.
Oh, sure.
If we're looking on that, like that 4.48 acres on Alamo Cantata, which may be one of the areas where you could do that, what happens if the people don't want to sell?
So that's a great question, actually. So what the city is looking to do in the housing element is provide the land, look at some of the constraints on that land. Say there's, in some cities there's land that has long agricultural leases, right? We don't want to use that land. There are certain things that we have to do to investigate feasibility on these sites. And certainly as part of the next workshop where we're actually talking about specific sites, if a constraint is mentioned, and that would be a constraint if the owner says, hey, I'm never, ever, ever gonna sell this, that would be a constraint that we would have to take into account.
Thank you.
Sure. So this is the exercise that we will be doing with sites. At the next workshop, we'll actually have some to suggest, and we'll be able to take your comments within the workshop as well as after the workshop online. You can submit comments on our website as well. So that's the sites inventory process. That is the process we'll be going through to try to meet the identified housing need in the housing element. So and then finally, if there isn't enough land, that the third set of options we have is to look at some new solutions. So we can rezone vacant non-residential sites to allow residential uses. I know that's a little difficult in Solvang because there's really a lack of vacant sites. And then we can also rezone underutilized commercial parcels to allow for high density multifamily or mixed use. Say there's an underutilized parcel that's between half an acre 10 acres in the TRC zone that really would be ideal for mixed use. That would be an option. And then finally, the section on affirmatively furthering fair housing. This is new to the housing element. In addition to providing sites, we also have to provide a whole new fair housing analysis. So what is affirmatively furthering fair housing, or AFFH? I know it's a mouthful, it's very hard to get used to saying, but it's defined this way. So affirmatively furthering fair housing means taking meaningful actions in addition to combating discrimination that overcome patterns of segregation and foster inclusive communities free from barriers that restrict access to opportunity based on protected characteristics. So AFFH really seeks to proactively, it's important, proactively combat housing discrimination, to work towards eliminating racial bias, to undo historic patterns of segregation and lift barriers that restrict access, and ultimately to foster inclusive communities and achieve racial equality, fair housing choice, and opportunity. And so within the housing element, the changes based on AB 686, which is driving AFFH, we have to have outreach specific to fair housing. We have to provide an assessment of fair housing that both touches on regional trends and local trends and local context. We have to analyze our sites through the lens of fair housing, as I mentioned before. And then we have to have priorities, goals, and actions that specifically further fair housing within the housing element, which is actually been a pretty hefty requirement of HCD. They want to see a lot. They want to see that not only do we have programs that that further fair housing, but that all of our programs have been analyzed through a fair housing lens to see how they interact with fair housing goals. So I know that was 20 minutes of me giving you a lot of information, but I just want to talk quickly about community outreach, and I have some discussion questions, and then we'll go over next steps once again. So first, we really want you to connect with us. The general plan has a website. The housing element has a section on that website, plansolvang.com/housing. We're going to post all upcoming events. We'll post the PowerPoint from this, any documents, any information. There's some resource information, some background information. We have a newsletter that I'll be posting probably either tonight or tomorrow morning with some more information. And then you can sign up for the email list. These buttons on the right-hand side, the orange one says email list. I know it's hard to see here, but you just click that, you put in your email and join the email list. The city actually has a fairly large email list. We'd love for you to be on it. We want to have as many participants as possible. And then this green button, if you hit that, you can actually send us your comments at any time. You don't have to wait for the public review draft to come out. You don't have to try to raise your hand in this meeting if too many people have their hands raised. You can just go online, click on that comments and send them. They are sent to the whole project team and they're documented. And we have to include those with the housing element and say how we responded to them. So we take your comments very seriously and we'd love to have them. And then finally, I know this isn't listed here, but there's a little icon here with a little guy. If you have accessibility concerns, go ahead and click that and it'll give you options for some different viewing options for the website. You can make text larger, things like that, just in case you need some visual accessibility concerns with the website. So really what I want, I wanted to give you all an intro to what we're doing, but what we really want to do is to hear from you. So I've got 4 discussion questions here. You don't have to comment on them. You can ask questions if you like. These are just trying to get this discussion going. If you have a comment on one of these, please raise your hand and give us your opinion. So the first is, what are the most pressing housing needs or issues in Solvang? So think about that. Maybe it's rental housing, maybe it's for sale housing to lower income households. You tell me. Then what are the barriers that residents face in finding housing? So are there common barriers that you hear a lot from people in town? Maybe the rent is just too high. You know, that's an obvious one there. And then a third question, this is on sites. So are you interested in a vacant site in town? Do you know of any sites that would be appropriate for meeting our arena? I know that I haven't given you any to consider, but I know there are people out in the city that are interested. So are you a developer? Are you a landowner? Are you a resident who has a site in mind? Please tell us. And then finally, part of our fair housing outreach, I want to ask a fair housing question in case anyone has any comments to make on this. So are there neighborhoods of the city that have perhaps older subsidized housing units or infrastructure issues? Are there areas that have high levels of affluence or poverty? And then are there areas that have, or neighborhoods that have restricted access to transportation, or parks, or maybe educational opportunities? Some larger cities have more educational, more fluctuation in their educational opportunities, maybe because there's multiple school districts. I don't know if that's the case in Solvang, but whatever it may be, if you feel like there's a fair housing issue, please comment on them. So I promise I will stop talking now, and I would love to hear from you. So I don't know how we want to facilitate questions, Zena.
While you're looking around, if I may,
You can go.
Yeah.
One of the things that is not addressed in any of this is water. We don't have an unlimited supply of water. You build that many more houses and it's going to put a demand on our water supply that I'm not sure that we can support.
Okay.
So I have never heard anybody say, and I have heard that there are other cities in the same situation that are writing letters to the state saying we can't support RENA because we don't have the water. What do we do? And unfortunately, I can't stand around for the answer, but I'd like to get it. I'll get back to reporting because I have to go to a groundwater sustainability agency meeting. So if you would answer that, I would appreciate it. I'll get the recording. Thank you.
Ryan, how comfortable do you feel, Ryan or Jim, answering that?
I could take a stab. I mean, essentially, the housing element is going to have to go through the CEQA process, which is going to look at the water supply issue at hand. A lot of times, I can't say for certain right now, but you know, depending on the analysis, impacts could be significant and unavoidable, and the city will have to make statements of overriding consideration. So essentially, that will be analyzed in the environmental review process a little bit down the road.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Ryan.
I would just add that one of the requirements of the housing element is that there's adequate infrastructure for any of the housing that's identified as satisfying the reallocation. So water supply and availability would be part of that analysis as well.
Okay. I think if we would just ask anybody that has a question or a comment to raise your hand. Everybody we have here with us are on Zoom. I do have a couple of people here in person from GPAC that are joining me at City Hall, and one has raised hands. So if you would come up to the podium.
Thank you, Zena. This is Dennis Beebe. What do I do? I'm good.
You just speak.
I've got a number of questions, and I'll try to remember them. Number one, could you give an example of what 20 units per acre looks like, existing? I can't picture it looking at charts and seeing numbers, so I'd appreciate an example of what 20 units per acre is. Number two, is the fair housing requirements that I guess come from the state and come from state laws. Is that the first time we've attempted to apply those requirements in a general plan? Or did we do it in the previous general plan or not? And so is this new to all of us? I'm also curious as to why it's part of our fair housing analysis to look at affluent neighborhoods. Is that, I just don't understand that as part of the fair housing analysis. That's all I can think of now. I may be up later. Thank you.
Okay. So I can take a first crack at responding to that. So we can certainly work with staff to come up with some visual examples of, developments that are about 20 dwelling units an acre. The type of thing you might expect would be, maybe townhomes, but we can find some examples and put them up on the website as well, just to be informative. And then as far as AFFH, this is a brand new law. So while the city has had fair housing goals in the past, the extent of this law is such that now all city actions have to be considered through the lens of fair housing. So it's on a whole new level now. The city, but it doesn't mean that the city didn't consider fair housing in the past, right? And then finally, when it comes to why study affluent neighborhoods, the fair housing analysis is looking for patterns of segregation, and it's looking for how zoning practices may or may not have affected those. So if you have a neighborhood that for some reason has a lot higher income than the neighborhood next to it, we want to look at why, and the state wants us to look at why.
Yeah, I'm sure Ryan Russell would have a comment or two. I would just add the kind of the overarching issue is to ask cities to avoid designating affordable housing in areas that what the state terms low resource areas, which are areas that are not close to schools, that don't have parks, don't have other access to typical community amenities, and so which typically higher income neighborhoods have access to. So the issue really is they want cities to look at a kind of a equal distribution of housing types throughout the city. That's the kind of the underlying purpose.
Yeah, I think that was all pretty well covered. I will note that as part of the AFFH, for segregation purposes, we're not just going to be looking at affluence. We'll be looking at other areas of the city have concentrated areas of certain ethnicities or races. We'll look at familial status. We'll look at disabilities. Are there certain areas of the city that have a high concentration of people with disabilities? Solvang's a pretty small city itself, so it might be certain neighborhoods that we'll be looking at, and we'll want your input on that and how you see the city fitting into those trends. So yeah, that's what we'll be looking at.
Great. Thank you. We have the next hand raised is Lansing Duncan. Lansing, go ahead.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. And thanks for hosting this workshop. I think it's a great way to get started. And obviously it tells us the complexity of this problem. But I would point out that simply the examples you chose to show really show the complexity of the problem. I'm going to give you some immediate feedback on the two parcels you chose to suggest might be zoned at 20 units per acre or 24 units per acre. And I'm a neighbor, and I've lived here 14 years, so I am pretty familiar with the site. Also, the owner of the property is tuning in tonight, so Sheriff Thomas, you could ask him if you wanted to sell that property or develop it at 20 units per acre. Okay, I would just point out there's a reason why it's currently zoned at 2 units per acre. And that's because it has very constrained access, for one thing. The intersection there at Old Mission and Alamo Pintado regularly backs up because you have backup at 246 in Alamo Pintado. And you can easily have cars lined up to turn left on 246 and cars trying to turn right on 246, and they're right backed up into Alamo Pintado Old Mission Drive intersection, and there are people trying to get out of the shopping center at the very same time. There are a whole lot of people trying to get in and out of that little intersection there to get to the shopping centers and the residences that are on Old Mission and in Mission Oaks, where I live. So it's very constrained in access. Also, of course, there's a divider in the road in Alamo Pintado there. So you could not get out of that site and attempt to turn left going up Alamo Pintado without going out Old Mission. You're forcing everybody who uses that site essentially to use that intersection, which is already really bad. I'd also point out that the larger parcel there sits way above the road. And if you stack 20 units per acre on top of that, it's going to not look very good for all those people who are driving up and down Alamo Pintado, not to mention the residents of where I am in Mission Oaks itself. And I also point out that the early planning documents actually identify the view over this property as a scenic view that is valuable to the city. So there's a whole lot of reasons why the idea of multiplying the density by 10 times or even more than 10 times than it's already zoned has not been done before. I do think you're going to have to get just more creative and innovative. I think there are sites that perhaps have slightly different zoning, maybe professional office zoning, where you already are assured of good access, where development at higher densities will be served by appropriate connectivity and also perhaps fewer conflicts in terms of compatibility with adjoining uses. And you're going to have to look at every nook and cranny. I would say the good news here is there's actually relatively few number of units that you have to identify the capability for. And it's good news that in fact that on the higher income spectrum, we're already taken care of, but you're never surprised at that. It's where we can get really creative. And I do think that a lot of this could be taken up in the way of mixed use. So I'm wondering what sort of credit could the city have for the mixed use potential that we already have and potentially could expand?
Yeah, so we take into account vacant parcels. So like in the TRC zone, there are very few vacant parcels. We would have to, the TRC currently allows residential, as I understand. So we could find a vacant parcel there and count it, much like we are counting our vacant residential parcels. We would have to make sure that there's not a conditional use permit requirement for that site. And if it's not vacant, if it's underutilized, we have to do a little bit a different calculation. We have to look into the feasibility of that site turning over. We have to look at if it's underutilized, what the improvement value is to the land value, things like that. So we are definitely creative people, and we are all in for getting creative with that stuff. But it is important, and the state wants us to provide land first through vacant land. They don't want you to provide more than half of your lower income units from underutilized sites that already have something that aren't vacant, for instance. And if you do, they make you really, really prove the feasibility. So we really do, we need to look first to vacant land. So we can look at, rezoning commercial vacant land or the vacancies that are in the TRC, and we will look at those.
Thank you.
And thank you for your comments on this site and any others. Please keep them coming.
Right, we have another hand up. John C., if you would state your name and please go ahead.
Hello, thank you, John Kroll. Just had a couple of questions. You said you were doing some outreach. What other outreach are you doing other than the website? For example, are you guys putting flyers on doors for residents in Solvang? And another question, would you guys be open to translation services for these meetings so that we could have non-English speakers participate as well and be able to have their voices heard? And then last question is, what are the income levels for the low and moderate, etc.? I don't think I heard that in the explanation.
Great questions. So I can start with the income categories first. I'm sorry I didn't explain that. And Ryan, if I state this incorrectly, please correct me. Moderate income is 80 to 100% of the median income level. Low income is 50 to 80%. Right? Very low is 30 to 50. And extremely low, which is a separate category, is 30 and below of the median household income. As far as other community engagement for this, most of it will be run through the website and also the public review draft, but we will be holding, it wasn't scoped, but we're holding an extra workshop on sites. That'll be in about 3 or 4 weeks. As well as study sessions with the Planning Commission and City Council, which will have opportunities for public comment. We will be then taking all those comments and revising the whole draft before we submit to HC. And then after we do our revisions, we will also go through the public hearing, that's PC and City Council hearings, to do the adoption hearings, and those will have public input as well. And then as far as translation services, I don't believe we are scoped or budgeted for that, but I'll talk to the team about considering that in the future.
And I would just add to the translation that we do have Spanish translation on the website. So we don't have that scoped in these live meetings and workshops at this point, but there is at least website material that is in Spanish language.
Yes, I forgot to touch on that as well. You can translate the whole website. Like there's a little menu at the top of the website that lets you choose your language. It'll go ahead and translate that for you.
Okay, would anybody else like to make a comment? If so, please raise your hand or unmute yourself. Okay, I see one more hand coming up. Nancy Emerson.
Yes, I would, Nancy Emerson Solvang, I would just like to add my voice to the earlier speaker who asked about translations and flyers. It seems to me that with almost 30% of our population being Latino, not all of them need translation, but some of them do. And it would be a real service to try to target the areas where that population is a higher percentage for translated flyers, to go to them, to encourage participation, to let them know about the website and its translatability. But it would be helpful to know the extent of the need if they're going to participate in meetings for translation and not just ignore that. That's my viewpoint on it.
Great, thank you. Thank you for your comment.
Okay, would anybody else like to make a comment? Or has a question? There's no more hands raised at this point. Raise your hand or just unmute yourself. Look for all of your input. Okay. Team, so far I'm not seeing any more public input here.
Okay. Well, I can quickly go over the next steps once again here. Hold that up. All right, can you see my PowerPoint here?
Yes.
Okay, so today was workshop number 1. As I mentioned before, it's not added here, but we are going to add workshop 2 in the next 3 to 4 weeks. So please keep an eye out for that. Add yourself on our email list so I can keep you updated on when that will be. But we're looking at going to public review, to releasing the public review draft this summer. And then, as I said, we'll have planning commission and city council study sessions on the draft. We'll incorporate revisions at that time, and then we'll submit to HCD over the summer. So HCD will review over the fall. We will work with them to meet all of their requirements and to respond to all their comments, and then we'll take that draft back to the planning commission and city council for hearings. Those will be in January, February is when they're scheduled for. Because again, the deadline for submission to HCD is February 15th, 2023. And again, we have a 120-day grace period there, but we want to try to hit our goals. So look for those final adoption hearings early next year. We'll have plenty meetings before that, but thank you for joining us tonight. I really appreciate everyone spending their time listening to us talk about housing elements. I know it's really dense. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Ryan.
All right, thank you everybody. Have a good night. We'll be back in touch with the next meeting in the next coming weeks.
California for the next 8 years.